John Wooden used to say, don't confuse activity with accomplishment. And the activity was moving people from the streets to somewhere where people didn't see them. And they say, see, we've solved the problem. But they weren't accomplishing anything because those people were still functionally homeless, right? They couldn't provide for themselves. Are we helping people go from where they are to a place of their highest level of self-sufficiency? That's the metric that matters, because that's the most humane metric. And the others are just truly, it's a shell game.
Welcome to The Op Edge, the Gazette's opinion podcast, where we bring you cutting-edge perspectives from Colorado's top newsmakers, columnists, and more. I'm Antonio Olivero, Deputy Opinion Editor, and your host for today's program. I'm pleased to take a deep dive into the state of Colorado's homelessness with Dustin Zvonek, Homelessness Fellow at the Common Sense Institute. Dustin, welcome to The Op Edge.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I appreciate you joining us. I appreciate you coming on. And just to start, tell us a little bit about your background, why homelessness policy means so much to you, and why Coloradans out there should value your perspective on this issue.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important topic. And it's one that I became really interested in back when I ran for city council. So I'm currently the Homelessness Fellow for the Common Sense Institute. Before that, I served on the Aurora City Council. And it was as a candidate, so I ran in 2021. So coming out of the pandemic, obviously homelessness was a big issue, not just in Aurora, but in the Denver metro area and frankly across the country. And as a candidate, I did the things that candidates do. I was an at-large. I was running for at-large, which means citywide in the city of Aurora. And so I'd go and meet with small businesses. And, the city of Aurora has a number of corridors in the central and northern part of the city, the Colfax corridor, and then what's referred to as the Havana bid along the Havana corridor, where you have a number of small, independently owned businesses, many of them owned by first and second generation immigrants, people who came to this country to live the American dream. And so I wanted to meet with them as a candidate and really understand what are some of the challenges and struggles that they're facing, so that if and when I was elected, I could help, try to address those issues. And, there were a variety of different topics that would come up depending on the business and the location. But the one common thread that I heard from a lot of those businesses was the challenge of homelessness, the encampments that were starting to pop up, along those corridors and in other parts of the city, and the deterrent that they were becoming for customers to come into their business because of, property crimes or what have you. And then beyond businesses, then I started to, meet with individual, I'd go door to door and I'd meet with individual residents and talk to them about what are the issues that are important to them. And I remember this vividly. I had a gentleman say, I want you to come in my house. And I was a little bit nervous. So we'd go into his house, walk in and look out off of his back deck. And behind his back deck, there was some open space and there was an encampment. And so now here he is, and he had two young daughters, an encampment just feet beyond his fence line. And he says regularly that there's a couple that live in there, and he's like, and I know that there's domestic abuse going on, but whenever we call the police and they show up, of course they say there's nothing going on. He's like, but I've seen it. And he's like, and so I worry about my children playing in my own backyard because of the encampments that are popping up. And then I heard from other residents just saying, here, when you're driving along the 225 corridor and you see these encampments, they're like, we're seeing these pop up just beyond the fence line of people's homes. We're seeing them pop up next to businesses. We're seeing them pop up along the sides of our highways, creating true public safety and public health concerns, not just for the residents who live in the city, but frankly, even for those who are in the encampments. And so that's really what piqued my interest in homelessness, is realizing that as a candidate and then ultimately as an elected member of the city council, I had to address that issue. It was a foundational issue to so many across the city. And so I went in with a focus on trying to find what is the best solution to the homeless challenge. And part of that was an education on what is, how did people get from wherever they were in life to this situation, to where they were living in their cars or in an encampment, and so that's what piqued the interest and really drove where I am today.
Well, Dustin, I think the interest that was piqued for you is something that most everyday Coloradans probably experienced, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. I know I've lived it myself. Just being around the tragedy of homelessness and whatever is leading to that situation, whether it be in Aurora or where I was in Denver, and throughout the kind of urban corridors up and down the Front Range. You obviously spoke to people who are not experiencing homelessness or living in homelessness or addicted to drugs, mentally ill, whatever the case may be. You spoke to how it affects them. Would you mind painting the picture for Coloradans who maybe haven't lived right next to it, the darker side of these encampments, these open-air drug markets, these situations for addicts or mentally ill or people just down on their luck, the darker side of what they have to live amongst and deal with and kind of sometimes even trade amongst in these encampments, and how, speaking to that, maybe does it affect women and children?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's really where, I had the opportunity to kind of dig deep as an elected official. I went and to different cities to learn more about homelessness. So I visited San Antonio, I visited Houston, Colorado Springs, and of course did encampment cleanups as an elected official in the city of Aurora. And I think that one of the key things to really understand, to try to wrap your mind around this really complex issue, is that the people who are experiencing homelessness there's not a monolith, right? Like there's actually, I like to say there's three general pools that you can kind of lump people into, but even within there's some nuance. So, when you talk to homelessness advocates, they'll say that, you have one group of people who are there that are, that these are the people who are down on their luck. They've had tough challenges with jobs that, frankly, they're not the ones that are going to be in their encampments. These are going to be people who are living in their car, they're at a shelter, and maybe even couch surfing with friends and family. They don't have a home of their own. But typically with this group of people, it's a smaller subset of the homeless population. They're not part of the visible homelessness in most cases. And they typically have a plan to get out of it, right? And maybe that plan isn't well defined, but they're working toward it. On the other far extreme is, you have a group of individuals who have such significant mental health issues that, frankly, they're never going to be self-sufficient. These are people who at one point in time in our country's history would have been in what was referred to as institutions. And obviously we've got rid of institutions, but the effect of that, or one of the effects, is that these individuals, especially those who don't have family, they end up on our streets or they end up in our prisons. And these are the ones that are the most visible, and that can create the most public safety concerns for themselves and for people around. And so you have that subset on one extreme. The others that I'd say are kind of temporary, unhoused. And then you have the big group in the middle, and this is the best way that this was described to me is you think about a 50 some odd year old veteran who maybe had some sort of low level anxiety or depression that was untreated, and started to cope with that because of the stigma, especially around mental health in men, started to treat with alcohol, and then alcohol became something, and now with these synthetic opioids and the effects that they have on people's mind, now they present as somebody who's schizophrenic. And so all too often, we want to treat those individuals as they have a mental health issue as opposed to an addiction issue. But there's a big pool of people experiencing homelessness that are there as a direct result of substance abuse. And the substance abuse has snowballed to the point to where they've lost their families, they've lost their job, they've lost any hope. And unfortunately, what I learned in visiting lots of different cities and the way they address homelessness is that they typically view housing as the solution and as a fix-all, and they don't see the need to really try to drive people towards services that are going to help them to kick the addiction and begin that process of moving towards self-sufficiency. And so they find themselves among in these encampments, and you described some of the darker side of it, is that these do end up being open air drug markets. These do end up being places where all sorts of domestic violence take place and are never reported, or if they are, they end up not being talked about. They're a very dangerous situation, and again, it's easy to say it's dangerous for the public, the general public, but frankly, it's as dangerous and frankly more dangerous for the people living in them.
Well, quoting your March Perspective piece in the Gazette, you argue, for years, policymakers have followed ideology instead of outcomes. CSI's nationwide data analysis removes any remaining excuse for doing so. The data is clear. Homelessness cannot be solved by housing alone. The sooner federal policy reflects that reality, the sooner real progress can begin. You touched on a little bit of that in your last response, but do you mind just sharing and expounding a little bit more, maybe even specifying what data from the recent
Yeah.
CSI study that you conducted backs up this critique of housing first?
Yeah, and I think it's important to let listeners know, like, what is housing first. And so that was something, as I was learning about homelessness, I'd heard the term and I was familiar with it, but what are the alternative views? But housing first is really it's become the preference of the federal government going back to about 2010. And the policy revolves around this idea that housing is what is going to ultimately change the lives of people experiencing homelessness. And you'll often hear that with housing first, they'll say we're going to make sure that we're taking people from the streets or out of their cars or wherever and put a shelter over their head to create stability for them. And then there's going to be wraparound services available for them. But the key with housing first is that those wraparound services, there's never any expectation or any sort of precondition for them to participate at any point in time in those services in order to have housing. And so you really end up putting people who have, in many instances, severe mental health issues or severe addiction challenges, and into housing, and say, hey, there's services here if you want them, but if you don't, no big deal. And so and then all the where policymakers, and this is what the data shows, is where policymakers conflate. John Wooden used to say, don't confuse activity with accomplishment. And the activity was moving people from the streets to somewhere where people didn't see them. And they say, see, we've solved the problem. But they weren't accomplishing anything because those people were still functionally homeless, right? They couldn't provide for themselves. And this is where, I've been critical for a long time of the housing first model, because I think the outcome that should be measured isn't the number of beds that you provide during a cold night or the number of meals that you provide over the course of the year. The measure should be, are we helping people go from where they are to a place of their highest level of self-sufficiency? That's the metric that matters, because that's the most humane metric. And the others are just truly, it's a shell game, and it's why the problem never really gets solved.
I think what you spoke to quite a bit there gets down to some basics of human nature that any father, mother, parent, community member, coach could speak to, incentives and disincentives. So if you wouldn't mind expounding on that, what are the positive and negative incentives and disincentives of homeless policy that are affecting Colorado's addicts, namely those who sadly have been swallowed whole by the demon that is addiction? And what are the most effective ways to break through to people in the throes of addiction?
So that's a great question, and that's exactly what we tried to accomplish when I was on council. I worked with Mayor Kaufman to bring forward a plan for the city that would be different. It was based off of a treatment first or a work first model, and the idea is exactly what you said. It's to create incentives. It's to create paths to self-sufficiency, and it would be structured paths to self-sufficiency. But the model that we based it off of was, so the Haven for Hope in San Antonio was at one point a treatment first or work first model, and then the Colorado Springs Rescue Mission was also founded on this type of model. And the premise is, and this is the way that we structured the Aurora Regional Navigation Campus that's being operated by Advanced Pathways, is to have this, it's a 3-tiered structure for homelessness. So on tier 1, this is your basic entry-level tier, right? These are the people who are in encampments and they need to get off the street because it's cold, because they can't, in many places like Aurora, we passed a camping ban. Colorado Springs has one. It's like you can't be on the side of the road. You got to go somewhere. So you have this tier 1. It's very basic. The accommodations are bare minimal. It's going to be, very light meals, like a bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, and it's going to be a cot that you're sleeping on, and you can't bring your personal items in. However, in tier 2, you have the opportunity to move into a more semi-private space. You get to bring in your your possessions, and you get access to a little better meals, like some bacon and eggs and things that there's an incentive. So people that are going into tier 1, they're like, wait, how do I get into those beds, into those accommodations? And it's like, well, what you have to do is you have to meet with a case manager. You have to start to work through your personalized path to self-sufficiency, because again, everybody's challenges are different. Some people's path might be a 3-month journey and others might be an 18-month. And there's going to be hiccups along the way. But the idea was to move from tier 1 to tier 2. You just had to say, yes, I'm willing to do it. Meet with that case manager and then stick with that path. And then the final tier is if they did that and they began to address whether it was addiction or mental health and become sober and could then start to work, they could go into tier 3, which was private rooms where they had to put some skin in the game. They were paying a small amount of rent, which essentially just went back into the program. But it was essentially from there, the idea was to then get into market or affordable rate housing on their own. So that the tiered system was creating incentives. There was expectations that they participate if they wanted to continue to stay there. And it really focused on that structured path to self-sufficiency for each individual, and knowing that everybody's path, as I said, is different.
Again, quoting from your March Perspective piece in the Gazette, you write, critics often characterize these models as treatment first or work first in a pejorative sense, suggesting they impose unreasonable barriers. In reality, they reflect a more honest understanding of homelessness as a complex social failure, not merely a market failure. Addiction, crime, and untreated behavioral health conditions are not side issues. They are central drivers, as CSI's analysis makes clear. You just touched on that a little bit, but if you wouldn't mind expounding and speaking to this, the nature of maybe how policy, I don't know if I want to say leverages, but kind of defines and redefines terms and kind of, praise off of the humanity that we have. How has Housing First maybe been misguided when it comes to defining success, in terms of compassion or accountability? That's a term that you hear often in the Housing First model, but I think a lot of everyday Coloradans, when they see the same people clearly suffering with addiction on their street corner for weeks, months, years at a time, they start to wonder to themselves, is this truly compassionate?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and an example that we see right now, right in front of us in our capital city of Denver, right? So you have Mayor Johnson has this program where, he was going out and buying hotels and places to put homelessness or people experiencing homeless, and a lot of that was being driven by the fact that there were so many homeless people around the city, around the 16th Street Mall, where people wanted to be, and the businesses there were essentially begging the mayor to do something. And so, he is very much a Housing First advocate, and has used the Housing First policy, where the priority has been, how do we get people who are on the streets, visibly the people you just described, visibly addicted, visibly mentally ill, and put them into housing. And so Housing First advocates will say, see, now they at least have a shelter over their head and they're housed, which I understand that, but that shouldn't be the end of it, right? Like, and just having wraparound services, this is where the failure comes in, because now you're putting those people with addiction issues into unsupervised housing with no expectations for any sort of services. And so far too often we end up seeing these people, whether they're some sort of overdose, or there's, lots of violence in these types of facilities. But the mayor will be able to go out and say, look, our point in time street count is lower. There's fewer people on the street. But really, then I've kind of flippantly said this is kind of like a hide the homelessness strategy. But those people aren't moving. The better metrics wouldn't be we have fewer people on the street just because we went and bought a bunch of hotels and put them in it. It's how many of those people did we move into these hotels that are provided, that then started to participate in services, and then had a movement towards self-sufficiency. Again, that's where Housing First, I actually think Housing First, or permanent supportive housing is a way they described it, is when we talked about the 3 buckets, right? The bucket of people who or have such significant mental health issues and no family to support them, there is some sort of permanent supportive housing that's needed for them, because there isn't a path to some sort of reasonable sustainability. So I can see we need almost like assisted living type care for those individuals. But for the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness, especially those with addiction, the goal shouldn't just be to get them off the street into housing, right? The goal should be to get them into programs where they can rediscover their purpose in life and become self-sufficient.
One last question, kind of on the human side, just the anecdotal side, the lived experience side of homelessness and what Coloradans experience. Then we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on policy and what affects that. If you're speaking to the average Coloradan who's pulling up to an interstate exit and stopped at the red light for a few minutes waiting to make a turn, they see someone there who is homeless and maybe clearly on drugs or struggling with some kind of mental illness, that person has empathy, that person has humanity, that person wants to help, that person maybe even wants to provide some money to that person. Just in your experience and in your research, but also as a human yourself, what would you say could be some good ways for that person in that moment to either donate financially or resources, or just helping the community, or maybe even in that moment to help that person? Because I think a lot of people sometimes wonder, man, if I give even $5 here, is that going to help or is that going to hurt?
Yeah, and I unfortunately, because I believe me, we've all experienced that, and so I have 4 young kids, and we, you pull up next to a homeless person, and my kids are like, Dad, let's help them. I mean, there is a deep compassion that I believe most people have for others in that situation, but the fact of the matter is you're not helping them. And when I was on council, one of my colleagues brought forward an effort to put signs up everywhere where you would typically, it says give real change, and it was to donate to organizations that actually tried to support homelessness in a meaningful way to help them. And so that's what I would say. There are a number of really good programs. As I mentioned, Advanced Pathways, the operator of the Aurora Regional Navigation Campus, incredible organization doing great work. Step Denver is another organization that I wish that you could supercharge and replicate, because they're tough, but man, do they have really good results. And so I think there are ways to be generous, to be helpful, but it's not in that moment of handing money to somebody on the side of the road.
So pivoting a little bit into the policy side and some things going on in the state, but also just the kind of the mechanisms of the machine and how it works, or how it kind of grinds to a stall. There's a lot of people listening to this who are living in Colorado, living amongst the homelessness and open air drug market epidemic, and they listen or they think and they say, okay, it seems kind of straightforward how we can help. Why is it taking so long, or why is it maybe seemingly not getting so much better? So my first question here is, where does the push and pull between the Trump administration's federal homelessness orders and state level policies practically leave not only the state of Colorado in terms of accomplishing goals, but localities? What can they do? Can they override rules from above? What kind of a position is a town in when trying to address this, close to home?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is really I think the heart of where the conversation needs to be if we're going to make progress. So as I mentioned, the federal government has had a priority for housing first policies, and the practical effect of that policy preference is that when HUD, that ships out billions of dollars every year to local governments, to states, to local governments to address homelessness, they were giving preference to programs that were operating under the housing first model, right? And so that's been going on for 16 plus years. And the Trump executive order is a great first step in the sense that it said, hey, listen, we don't want any longer for HUD to prioritize housing first. That's great. The challenge is, I believe, is that I think this needs to be codified by Congress as opposed to an executive order. And the reason being is that if I'm operating a nonprofit in Colorado that says, hey, look, we're going to do something different. we're going to go with a work first or treatment first program, and we're going to go to HUD now and ask for resources because they are no longer going to prioritize housing first, which we are clearly not. The problem is that if you then become dependent on those federal resources and the next president comes in and just undoes the EO, you put yourself in a really tough position. So I think the way that you're going to see the really positive intentions of the Trump EO trickle down, faster and into local governments and into states would be if Congress would codify the executive order, because while it wouldn't be permanent, because obviously another Congress could do it, if you could get it passed through Congress, it'd be tougher to unwind. And I would say my suggestion would say, hey, don't say you can't do housing first. Just say that there isn't a preference. Let states and local governments be laboratories of democracy. Let them come to HUD with plans, but the metric should always be not just that what we described earlier, which is number of cots provided or meals provided. Those are vanity metrics. They're important to some extent, but the real metric should be what was your homeless population and how many of those people have you helped move towards their highest level of self-sufficiency.
Well, there certainly, as you just spoke to, are hurdles at the federal level. There are hurdles at the state level as well. And I think anyone, someone like yourself who's on whatever ideological side of this issue is aware that there is a lot of ideology that drives a lot of the success or lack thereof, or just the approaches when it comes to this issue. In terms of the practical power, where does that lie sometimes with regards to litigation, civil rights litigation that affects policymaking and namely law enforcement? I think that's something a lot of everyday Coloradans, they'll see something, they maybe want to help, whether it's themselves from being victimized or the people in these encampments. They'll go to the police, they'll reach out in their community, and sometimes the response they get is, well, there's only so much we can do, especially, and that's specifically due to, litigation and how that affects, law enforcement's ability to respond and to apprehend potentially in some cases.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I'll tell you that there is local governments genuinely do have a significant amount of authority and ability to address this issue, but they have to be willing to do tough things. So when I was on council, myself and my colleagues, we did things. So when I got elected on the council, we didn't have a camping ban. And so the people could camp on the sides of the street. There was no recourse for law enforcement. So, our citizens would call in and complain, but there was nothing you could do unless it was on private property to really address it. So we passed a camping ban. And then the next thing we had to do is we had to create a trespassing ordinance that would say that you couldn't just, take your stuff once you got noticed for your 24 or 72 hour notice to take your encampment, and you got to go someplace else. We had to create a trespassing ordinance so they couldn't just go to some other location. You have to put real teeth behind it so that they can, in fact, potentially be arrested. And that's not the goal of it, right? The goal of a camping ban, the reason why I supported it, was that I knew that we were going to have the navigation campus. And the goal is that if you can't camp, you're either going to have to go out of the city of Aurora, but this is where regional solutions are genuinely needed, or you've got to go to into the shelter or into the regional navigation campus, where you're going to be introduced to the idea of participating in whatever services that are required to help you to move forward. So that I think local governments, there are ways to address it. We also were working on when I was on council, we were working on similar to a drug court, where you can compel people to participate. We're going to have a separate homelessness court in the municipal level that would, again, where you had a little bit more ability to compel people to participate if they were, constant offenders of the trespassing laws that we put on the books related to homelessness. Now, unfortunately, I think that the new majority on the council is likely to undo a lot of this. I hope they don't, but it seems likely that they will. But I think these are the types of, they're tough, but I think they're fair. And I think that's what I had mentioned. Step Denver. It's one of the reasons why I think that their program is successful, is that they really have a zero tolerance in terms of like not participating if you're going to continue to go through their program, because they know that if you're going to get sober, it's not an easy thing to do, and it requires somebody, providing a little tough love.
Two final questions before we wrap, and the first one, maybe if you could just sum up somewhat quickly for our listeners. Can you break down House Bill 26-1202 in layman's terms and why you think it would be ineffective?
Yeah, so the things that it does, whenever you have the state coming in, and I think there's some positives that could come of it. I just don't have confidence that it will. So, one, it would require regional collaboration. It requires it says that if you can create regional authorities, and they can be taxing authorities, which also frightens me. The reason why I think ultimately that this will become ineffective is that, so if the state is then just funding, through and allowing these local governments to create regional authorities to then tax, my worry is that they're just going to create more housing, more low-income housing, as opposed to providing services. I think the better solution is finding nonprofits that have a history of providing services to individuals, whether that's for veterans, for addiction recovery, and allowing them to work on those specific issues that are going to help people move forward. My worry with this bill is that you're going to just create another way for us to create more housing that is just going to become shelters that don't provide services, and again just become warehouses for homeless.
Last question, kind of open-ended, but whatever it is you think people don't know enough about, please expound on it. But the question is, what are some elements or variables of Colorado's homeless situation that are not being talked about enough?
I think it's just how much the federal government's policy for housing, preference for housing first, impacts the local government's abilities to pursue new ideas. And I saw this firsthand when we were trying to create, first starting the regional navigation campus. Part of the goal was to move away from the city having to spend millions of dollars every year on homelessness. That's actually not something that I believe municipal taxpayers should be funding. But we knew that if we were going to form a navigation campus that didn't follow the housing first policy, that we were going to be hamstrung to some extent. And that's exactly where they are. Now, the Trump EO opens up a window, but as I mentioned before, unless it's codified by Congress, there is a huge risk for advanced pathways to start taking federal dollars, and then only to have a president in the future unwind that executive order. So I think that, when you talk about the challenges, you have to recognize that most of it's being driven by, chronic addiction, mental health issues, and that just simply putting people into housing is not addressing those. And that is what the policy preference of the federal government has been rewarding, is just putting people into housing, not necessarily participating in services.
Dustin Zvonek, Homelessness Fellow at the Common Sense Institute. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you all for tuning into The Op-Edge. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like, subscribe now on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, and be sure to share it with your friends and colleagues. For the Gazette, I'm Antonio Olivero.